Inventing the Future. Postcapitalism and a World Without Work. By Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams. Chapter 5. The future isn't working. It is already contained in the concept of the free laborer, that he is a pauper, a virtual pauper. Karl Marx. We have so far argued that the contemporary left tends towards a folk politics that is incapable of turning the tide against global capitalism. In its place, the left needs to reclaim the contested legacy of modernity and advance visions for a new future. It is imperative, however, that its vision of a new future be grounded upon actually existing tendencies. This chapter sets out a conjunctural analysis of contemporary capitalism, viewed through the lens of work. On the basis of this analysis, the next chapter will argue for the desirability of a future without work. What does it mean to call for the end of work? By work, we mean our jobs, or wage labor, the time and effort we sell to someone else in return for an income. This is time that is not under our control, but under our bosses, managers and employers' control. A full 1/3 of our adult lives is spent in submission to them. Work can be framed in contrast to leisure, typically associated with the weekend and holidays. But leisure should not be confused with idleness, as many of the things we enjoy most involve immense amounts of effort. Learning a musical instrument, reading literature, socializing with friends and playing sports all involve varying degrees of effort, but these are things that we freely choose to do. A post-work world is therefore not a world of idleness, rather, it is a world in which people are no longer bound to their jobs, but free to create their own lives. Such a project draws upon a long line of thinkers, Marxists, Keynesians, feminists, black nationalists and anarchists alike, who have rejected the centrality of work. These thinkers have, each in their own way, sought to liberate humanity from the drudgery of work, the dependence on wage labor, and the submission of our lives to a boss. They have struggled to open up the realm of freedom from which humanity can continue its project of emancipation. While the broad aims of this project have a long series of precedents, recent developments in capitalism give renewed urgency to these issues. Rapid automation, expanding surplus populations and the continued imposition of austerity all heighten the need to rethink work and prepare for the new crises of capitalism. Just as the Mont Pelerin Society foreshadowed the crisis of Keynesianism and prepared a full-spectrum set of responses, so too should the left prepare for the coming crisis of work and surplus populations. While the effects of the 2008 crisis continue to reverberate throughout the world, it is too late to take advantage of that moment. All around us we can see that capital has recovered and consolidated itself in a renewed and sharpened form. The left must instead prepare for the next opportunity. This chapter explains why a post-work world is an increasingly pressing option. The first section outlines the emerging crisis of work, the breakdown of stable jobs in developed countries, the rise of unemployment and surplus populations, and the collapse of work as a disciplinary measure holding society together. We then turn to the various symptoms of this crisis as it is manifested not only in unemployment figures, but also in increased precarity, jobless recoveries, growing slums and expanding urban marginality. All around us we can see the effects of this shift bubbling up in new social conflicts and problems. Finally, we look at the various ways in which capitalism's tendency to produce surplus populations has been managed by the state. Today, the crisis of work threatens to overrun these traditional tools of control, laying the social conditions for the shift to a post-work world. Virtual paupers. While work is common to every society, under capitalism it takes on historically unique qualities. In pre-capitalist societies, work was necessary, but people had shared access to land, subsistence farming and the necessary means of survival. Peasants were poor but self-sufficient, and survival was not dependent on working for someone else. Capitalism changed all this. Through the process called primitive accumulation, pre-capitalist workers were uprooted from their land and dispossessed of their means of subsistence. Peasants struggled against this and continued to survive on the margins of the emerging capitalist world, and it eventually took violent force and harsh new legal systems to impose wage labor on the population. Peasants, in other words, had to be made into a proletariat. This new figure of the proletariat was defined by its lack of access to the means of production or subsistence, and its requirement for wage labor in order to survive. This means that the proletariat is not just the working class, nor is it defined by an income level, profession or culture. Rather, the proletariat is simply that group of people who must sell their labor power to live, whether they are employed or not. And the history of capitalism is the history of the world's population being transformed into proletarian existence through the advancing dispossession of the peasantry. With the recent integration of post-communist countries and the rise of China and India, the global proletariat has seen a great doubling, with 1.5 billion more people now reliant upon waged work for survival. But with the emergence of the proletariat, there also comes a new form of unemployment. In fact, unemployment as we understand it today was an invention of capitalism. Having been torn away from their means of subsistence, for the first time in history a new surplus population emerges that is unable to find waged work. While capitalism may exploit the employed working class, as Joan Robinson once wrote, the misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. For the most part, the size of this surplus expands and contracts in tandem with economic cycles. All things being equal, as economies grow, workers are drawn from the surplus and into waged labor, the unemployment level decreases, and the labor market tightens. At a certain point, however, economic demand stalls, wages begin to cut into profitability, or workers become too politically bold. For reasons of profitability, or inflation, or simply to regain political power over the working class, workers are laid off. The surplus subsequently expands, held in reserve for the next cycle of growth. Yet these cyclical mechanisms only partly explain our current situation, particularly given that wage pressures have been stagnant for decades, inflation has remained stable, and the labor movement has been devastated. The cyclical account based on economic demand certainly accounts for the depth of the 2008 crisis, but it does not explain longer-term changes in the labor market such as the rise in precarity, the emergence of jobless recoveries, and the growth of non-capitalist labor markets. To understand the current conjuncture fully, other tendencies therefore need to be taken into account. These are the mechanisms that produce a secular trend towards a larger and larger surplus population, independently of cyclical boom and bust patterns. It is these that pose the biggest threat to the reproduction of capitalist social relations. Today, the production of surplus populations through technological change has increasingly hypnotized the media's imagination. While this attention has been focused on fears of an imminent job apocalypse carried out by vast armies of robots, technological developments can also make older processes more productive without automation, for example, advances in agriculture. In either case, productivity enhancements mean that capitalism needs less labor to produce the same output. Automation appears as the most imminent threat, however, with estimates suggesting that anything from 47% to 80% of current jobs are likely to be automatable in the next 2 decades. But estimates based solely on advances in technology are insufficient to predict growing unemployment. After all, despite continually rising productivity, employment has remained relatively stable throughout the history of capitalism. With some painful delays, new jobs have been created to replace those that were lost. Yet sanguinity based on past experiences overlooks the political and contingent basis of this historical record, government policies, workers' movements, the gendered division of the labor force, and simultaneous reductions in the work week have all played a role in sustaining employment in the past. As a result, additional qualifications are necessary to understand under what conditions technological change will lead to increased unemployment. A first qualification argues that because increased productivity lowers production prices, unemployment only increases when demand fails to grow enough in response to these lower prices. If the cheaper prices spark more sales, the company may expand rather than cut workers. A similar argument suggests that technological developments often create new industries, and that this potentially creates replacement jobs. Since the introduction of the personal computer, for instance, over 1,500 new job types have emerged. In either of these cases, consumers buy more goods because they are cheaper or new, and others are kept employed. The same logic holds for services. The rollout of ATMs, for example, led to fewer bank tellers being employed in each branch, but banks responded to the cheaper costs by opening more branches and expanding their market share. The result was that the number of bank tellers remained steady, though this may be changing today, as banks move their services online. In all of these cases, the logic is that even if technology eliminates some jobs, demand grows sufficiently to create new jobs. In a second situation, technological change reaches such a speed that an increasingly large portion of the population becomes unable to keep up with the skills needed. In this case, even if new demand can be created, there simply are not enough capable workers to take up these jobs, the supply of labor falters. The speed of technological change and diffusion may render entire segments of the population as an obsolete surplus. In a third situation, labor-saving technologies can be of such general use that they diffuse across the entire economy, dampening the overall demand for labor. In this circumstance, even if new industries are created, they will require increasingly less labor because these technologies have a wide range of applicability. If any of the above conditions hold, then technological change can lead to increased unemployment. As we will see, there are good reasons to believe a number of these conditions do hold. But while technological unemployment is the most prominent reason today for swelling surplus populations, it is not the only one. Another mechanism that actively changes the size of the surplus is one we have already noted: primitive accumulation. This is not just an origin story of capitalism, but also an ongoing process that involves the transformation of pre-capitalist subsistence economies into capitalist economies. Through various means, a poor but self-sufficient peasantry is forced off its land and made to rely on wage labor to survive. As we've seen, with globalization, this process has accelerated and led to a doubling of the proletariat. The supply of rural labor that China can draw upon is dwindling, but the integration of Africa and South Asia means the worldwide supply of labor continues to increase at a rapid pace. The outcome of this is a vast new global labor force, dependent upon the creation of equally vast numbers of new jobs. Therefore, independently of any technological changes in capitalist production, surplus population have increased because of this new labor supply. In addition to this, a third mechanism involves the active exclusion of a particular population from capitalist wage labor. Both in the past and present, this has predominantly involved the exclusion of women and racial minorities from the job market. While the problems of slavery, racism and sexism are not reducible to capitalist imperatives, indeed, they have separate logics of domination, these phenomena have also indirectly served capitalist goals. Unfree labor in the form of slavery is well documented as a key element of capitalism's origins, and continues today, and the unpaid labor of many women and racialized prison populations continues to act as a source of hyper-exploitation. On a more modest level, unemployment continues to be distributed unevenly across distinctions of race, gender and geography. Witness the devastation of post-industrial cities, for instance. Certain groups are more likely to be the last hired during a boom, and the first fired during a recession. The vulnerabilities that surplus populations face are therefore differentiated between sexes and races, an economic logic of exploitation and expulsion intersecting with other logics of oppression. But in all of these cases, surplus populations are concentrated within a particular group as a result of political, legal and social structures. It is not, in other words, technological change or primitive accumulation that is responsible for their difficulties in finding waged labor. But these mechanisms often intersect with each other. Some people are more likely to be affected by technological change, and the incorporation of new surplus populations usually involves racial coding. In a myriad of ways, these mechanisms, technological change, primitive accumulation and active exclusion, generate an expanding number of proletariat outside the formal workforce. What, then, is the composition of the surplus population today? Broadly, we can divide it into 4 different strata: the capitalist segment, the non-capitalist segment, the latent segment and the inactive segment. The first segment we are all familiar with, the unemployed and underemployed, situated within the normal capitalist labor market. This group has access to at least some minimal state welfare, is actively seeking another job, and therefore exerts pressure on the wages of the employed. Yet, for most of the world, being unemployed is a relative luxury. In the absence of any social safety net, most people must constantly work to survive, and are therefore forced into creating new subsistence economies alongside capitalism. This is the non-capitalist segment of the surplus population, filled with people who have been dispossessed of their means of subsistence but have few social safety nets, either community or state-based, to allow them to go without work for long. These subsistence economies produce goods for the market, small trinkets, for example, but they are organized as non-capitalist forms of production in that they do not seek to accumulate. These types of economies increasingly dominate the labor market of the developing world, ranging from 30 to 80% of the working population in any given country. A third latent group exists primarily in pre-capitalist economic formations that can be readily mobilized into the capitalist labor market. This includes the reservoir of proto-proletarians, including peasants, but this group also includes unwaged domestic laborers, as well as salaried professionals who are under threat of being returned to the proletariat, often through de-skilling, for example, medical professionals, lawyers and academics. The importance of this group is that it forms an additional reservoir of labor for capitalism when existing labor markets are tight. Finally, in addition to the other strata, a vast number of people are considered economically inactive, including the discouraged, the disabled and students. Overall, determining the precise size and nature of the global surplus population is difficult with existing data, and subject to fluctuations as individuals move in and out of categories, but a variety of measures converge to suggest it significantly outnumbers the active working class. This is the crisis of work that capitalism faces in the coming years and decades, a lack of formal or decent jobs for the growing numbers of the proletarian population. In an earlier generation, the identification of surplus populations as a problem was an idea that was often derided. During the golden age of capitalism, low unemployment, stable jobs, rising wages and rising living standards meant the idea that capitalism produced a surplus humanity enjoyed little material support. Yet, while most leftist thinkers turned to the economic problems of growth for capitalism, an occluded intellectual tradition has instead emphasized the social reproduction problem of surplus populations. It is no surprise that it was often those outside the functioning capitalist order who saw the potential in this surplus class. Writing from Algiers in the 1970s, Eldridge Cleaver presciently argued that when workers become permanently unemployed, displaced by the streamlining of production, they revert back to their basic, proletarian, condition, and that the real revolutionary element of our era is the proletariat. From the capitalist core, Paul Matic called it the most important of all capitalistic contradictions. And more recently, communization theorists have made important contributions to analyzing the crisis of wage labor, and Frederick Jameson has argued that Capital is not a book about politics, and not even a book about labor, it is a book about unemployment. Indeed, it is often forgotten that Marx argued that the expulsion of surplus populations was part of the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. In the wake of the 2008 crisis and continued sluggishness in the labor market, it is no surprise that the issue of surplus populations should emerge again. With technological change proceeding apace, the already large numbers of surplus humanity look set to swell. The very social basis of capitalism as an economic system, the relationship between the proletariat and employers, with waged work mediating between them, is crumbling. The misery of not being exploited. As we have seen, very little of the global labor force is employed in formal wage labor, and this number has only decreased in the wake of the 2008 crisis. The most obvious symptoms of this rising surplus population are embodied in the long-term changes in unemployment statistics. In the immediate post-war era, unemployment as low as 1 to 2% was once considered a viable goal of developed economies. During the 1950s and 1960s, the UK and the United States saw unemployment hover around 2%, while Germany even saw unemployment dip below 1%. Each decade since has seen a ratcheting up of the acceptable level of unemployment, combined with decreases in employment growth. Today, the Federal Reserve considers 5.5% to be the optimal long-term unemployment rate, more than doubling the post-war levels. In the United States, the percentage of men not working has tripled since the late 1960s, and the percentage of women has also increased, despite starting at a much higher level. The proportion of people employed has dropped precipitously, and the overall surplus population has been growing consistently in recent decades. At a global level, the unemployment rate has continued to rise after the 2008 crisis, both in absolute and relative terms. The global rate of job creation has remained significantly lower, has largely generated part-time jobs, and is forecast to continue its sluggish trend. Meanwhile, labor force participation rates have been declining globally for decades, and are set to continue falling for decades more. Yet these statistics are only the tip of the iceberg. The crisis of work and the effects of surplus populations are expressed not only in these direct measures, but also through a series of more subtle and indirect effects. One of these, increased precarity, has come to exemplify the neoliberal labor market in developed economies. Relative to the stable and well-paying careers of earlier generations, today's jobs typically involve more casual working hours, low and stagnant wages, decreasing job protections and widespread insecurity. This trend towards precarity has a number of causes, but one of the primary functions of a surplus population is that it enables capitalists to place extra pressure on the lucky few who have found a job. As the surplus grows and the labor market slackens, more workers seek after fewer jobs, and power passes over to the employers. The threat of moving a factory, for instance, is only possible with a global labor glut. The result is that employers gain strength over workers and the quality of jobs decreases, supplementing the quantity measured by unemployment statistics. This is exactly what we have seen in the past few decades. Throughout Europe, the intensity of work, in terms of both speed and demands, has increased. The shift to just-in-time supply chains has exacerbated the demands of work, while new surveillance technologies are being forced upon laborers, in some cases, even monitoring them outside of work hours. The decline in the quality of jobs can also be seen in the cutting of work hours, rather than the outright elimination of jobs. We can see this in the small but growing number of part-time, flexible and freelance jobs over the past 30 years. For instance, the relatively low unemployment levels of the UK after the 2008 crisis are largely a result of more self-employed people living off poverty wages. In the United States, more than 6.5 million people are forced to work part-time despite desiring full-time work. This casualization also involves innovations such as crowdsourced tasks, temporary staffing agencies and zero-hours contracts, along with the harsh working conditions and lack of benefits that accompany them. In the UK, for example, it is estimated that nearly 5% of the working population is presently on zero-hours contracts. Surplus populations have also put downward pressure on wages. Estimates suggest that every 1% increase in labor market slack is associated with a 1.6% increase in income inequality. The stagnation of real wages and the declining share of income going to labor are both tied to an excess supply of labor, and most economists believe automation and the globalization of the proletariat are central reasons why wages have been stagnant in recent decades. All of these trends have continued since the 2008 crisis as well, with slow real wage growth across the G20 and outright decline in the UK. The slow growth of wages leads precarity to also be expressed in the anxiety over high levels of consumer debt and low levels of personal savings. In the United States, for example, A full 34% of full-time workers live paycheck to paycheck, while in the UK, 35% of people could not live off their savings for more than a month. And at its most vicious, precarity is indicated by a rise in depression, anxiety and suicides, an excess that goes uncounted in traditional economic measures. Indeed, unemployment is associated with a fifth of all global suicides, and this has only worsened in the wake of the financial crisis. In addition to precarity, surplus populations and technological automation help to make sense of a recent labor market phenomenon, the emergence of jobless recoveries, in which economic growth returns after a crisis but job growth remains anemic. Such recoveries have become standard for the US economy, and since the 1990s the trend has been towards longer and longer jobless recoveries. The current crisis is no exception, with more than 1 million full-time jobs yet to return, and forecasts suggesting that US unemployment will remain above pre-crisis levels until 2024. This is a global phenomenon as well, with the world economy creating jobs so slowly that the number of jobs will remain significantly below pre-crisis levels for at least a decade. While their cause is ultimately still a mystery, jobless recoveries appear to be closely related to automation. In fact, the only occupations that have experienced jobless recoveries are those that have been under threat from automation in recent decades, semi-skilled, routine jobs. Moreover, these job losses have occurred almost entirely during and in the wake of recessions. In other words, crisis periods are when automatable jobs disappear, never to be heard from again. If automation accelerates over the coming decades, these problems are likely to intensify, with capital using periods of crisis to permanently eliminate such jobs. The slow return of jobs also expresses itself as a rise in long-term unemployment, whereby entire groups of people become increasingly segregated from the normal labor market. Since the most recent crisis, the average length of unemployment has doubled and remained stubbornly high. These extended periods of unemployment suggest that a structural problem is responsible, that is to say, a problem that takes longer for unemployed workers to adapt to, such as retraining for an entirely new skill set. Workers laid off from an area like retail will find it difficult to immediately step into a job in growth sectors like programming. Meanwhile, when the long-term unemployed do find a job, they are more likely to enter at the margins of the labor market, with lower pay and more temporary work. Jobless recoveries, in other words, exacerbate the problems of precarity, and increasingly segregate out a portion of the population as permanently underemployed. Ultimately, unemployment and the threat of it are becoming the norms for the labor force. In some urban areas, joblessness and segregation from the normal labor market have long been features of everyday existence. In the banlieue of Paris, the ghettos of the United States and the rising spaces of suburban poverty, entire communities have been economically separated from broader economic trends, stagnating even during periods of growth. More often than not, these segregated spaces are also divided along racial lines, with deliberate neglect and outright exclusion transforming these communities into increasingly harsh areas of poor social cohesion, inadequate housing and high unemployment. The historical origin of these spaces is well known: racism, slavery and the active exclusion carried out by policy choices, physical violence and white migration. In early 20th century America, for example, the mechanization of agriculture led the rural black population to migrate and concentrate in urban areas. Yet jobs were hard to come by, as continued racism excluded them from working in textiles or manufacturing. The racialization of the surplus population also enabled owners to manipulate the white working class, keeping wages low and preventing unionization. As capitalism grew in the post-war era, manufacturing jobs eventually opened up to the black population, and by the mid-1950s rates of black and white youth unemployment were broadly similar. But then the globalization of the labor supply wreaked havoc on low-skilled black workers. With manufacturing jobs shipped overseas or subject to automation, these workers were disproportionately affected by deindustrialization. Industrial jobs left the urban centers and were replaced by service work often located in distant suburban areas. The urban ghettos were left to rot, becoming concentrated hubs of long-term joblessness. They became poverty traps, devoid of jobs, with little community support and a proliferation of underground economies. Entire communities were cast aside from the machinery of capitalism and left to fend for themselves with whatever means could be scraped together. People seeking an income were forced into off-the-books work, new businesses turned to loan sharks after being denied by white-owned banks, and increasing desperation led to outright illicit activities. Mirroring the concentration of joblessness in the urban margins, developing economies have had to deal with the expansion and concentration of surplus populations in slums, favelas and shanty towns. Globally, these have swelled to unprecedented levels as the urban workforce is tossed aside into the informal and marginal economies. As one UN report puts it, the cities have become a dumping ground for a surplus population working in unskilled, unprotected and low-wage informal service industries and trade. The primary cause behind this expansion of slums has been primitive accumulation. Spurred on, first by colonialism and then by structural adjustment policies, the peasantry in many developing countries has been forced off their lands via global competition, rapid industrialization and rampaging climate change. Like the earlier European experience of industrialization, dispossessed rural workers have migrated to urban areas to find jobs. And in Europe, too, this process sometimes led to slum dwelling and destitution for the new urban proletariat. But this is where the similarities end, as in Europe the transition involved creating sufficient numbers of jobs, the emergence of a strong industrial working class, and the eventual provision of housing for migrants. Under conditions of post-colonial development, this narrative has been broken. Rather than a scarcity of labor, recent industrialization has occurred in the context of a large and global labor force. The result has been little development of anything resembling a traditional working class, continually weak job prospects and a lack of adequate housing. New urban migrants have been left in a permanent state of transition between peasantry and proletarianization, and sometimes in seasonal circulation between rural existence and urban poverty. Slums and other improvised housing therefore represent a dual expulsion from the land and from the formal economy. This surplus humanity, having been deprived of its traditional means of subsistence yet left without employment, has been forced to create its own non-capitalist subsistence economies. Much of the labor performed here is informal, low-paid, insecure, irregular and without state support. In these economies, production is typically organized in non-capitalist forms but remains directed towards commodity production, to selling goods on the market, rather than for individual use. Mediation by the market distinguishes these post-colonial subsistence economies from pre-capitalist subsistence economies, even though they both function as a desperate means of survival. But while primitive accumulation is responsible for the origins of these slums, it is premature deindustrialization that looks set to consolidate their existence. If previous periods of industrialization at least had the benefit of providing enough factory jobs for the new proletariat, premature deindustrialization threatens to eliminate this traditional pathway entirely. Technological and economic developments now enable countries to virtually leapfrog the industrialization phase, which means that developing economies are now deindustrializing at much lower rates of per capita income and with much lower shares of manufacturing employment. China is a good example of this, with manufacturing employment in decline, labor struggles becoming more confident, real wages surging and demographic limits leading to a focus on technological upgrading and productivity enhancements in order to maintain growth. The automation of factories is at the leading edge of this deindustrialization trend, with China already the biggest purchaser of industrial robots, and expected to soon have more industrial robots in operation than either Europe or North America. The factory of the world is going robotic. Deindustrialization can also be seen in reshoring, where manufacturing returns to developed economies in jobless, automated forms. These deindustrialization trends are taking hold across the developing economies of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa and most of Asia. Even in countries where manufacturing employment has increased in absolute terms, there have been significant decreases in the labor intensity of the process. The result of all of this is not only an incomplete transition to a significant working class, but also the stymieing of the expected employment path for the workforce. Premature deindustrialization is leaving most of the world's urban proletariat dispossessed of its agricultural livelihood and without the opportunity to be hired for manufacturing jobs. Some hold out the hope that an emerging service sector will absorb the surplus populations, yet this appears increasingly unlikely. Even in India, the center of service and high-tech outsourcing, only a small portion of the labor force works in the information and communication technology sector. More importantly, the potential of service jobs is constrained by the newest wave of automation, which is likely to eliminate the low-skilled, low-wage service jobs that have traditionally been outsourced, clerical work, call center work or data entry, for example. As this non-routine cognitive labor is increasingly automated, what may occur is a premature shift away from a service-based economy, on top of premature deindustrialization. What this means is that the maintenance of large portions of humanity within slums and informal, non-capitalist economies is likely to be consolidated by emerging technological trends. In the end, while unemployment measures give us some sense of the size of the surplus population problem, it is precarity, jobless recoveries and mass urban marginality that truly express the squeeze on the global labor market. Revenge of the surplus. Larger surpluses of labor are, on the one hand, beneficial to capitalist interests. They serve as a disciplinary tool against the working class, particularly when filtered through racism, nationalism and sexism, and as a reserve to call upon in times of growth. They reduce wages, sow competition among workers and shackle the ambitions of the proletariat. These are among the reasons behind a gradual drive to incorporate the world's population into a global labor force, fostered by imperialism and globalization. On the other hand, capital requires a particular type of surplus population, cheap, docile and pliable. Without these characteristics, this excess of humanity becomes a problem for capital. Not content to lie down and accept its disposability, it makes itself heard through riots, mass migration, criminality, and all sorts of actions that disrupt the existing order. Capitalism therefore has simultaneously to produce a disciplined surplus and deploy violence and coercion against those who resist. One of the principal ways to manage the unruly surplus has been to champion the social democratic ideal of full employment, whereby every physically capable worker has a job. In support of this ideal, economic policies aim to reincorporate the surplus into capitalism as disciplined and waged workers, secured by a hegemonic consensus between the representatives of labor and capital. The apogee of this approach was the post-war period, when working-class struggle and conservative concern with social order positioned full employment as a necessary economic goal. In this brief golden age of capitalism, unemployment was kept to a minimum, and capital had to seek out pre-capitalist populations around the world in order to expand and accumulate. For the most part, job growth was achieved through healthy economic growth that increased the demand for labor. Historically, growth of the national economy has often been important in warding off the effects of technological unemployment, either by increasing the output of existing industries or by inventing new industries to employ the displaced workers. For instance, during the latter half of the 1800s, the rise in capital goods output created jobs that offset the surplus population newly released from the agricultural sector. In the pre-war and post-war eras, growth in manufacturing jobs was sustained by the rise of mass consumerism and surges in government military spending. Today, we can see similar attempts at creating new markets through accumulation by dispossession, turning public or common goods into privatized and monetized commodities. If increases in labor demand are to be successful, however, they require the right supply of labor, which means an increasingly high-skilled workforce. Education has been the primary way to achieve this, with, for example, secondary education having its origins in efforts to produce more skilled workers. The demand to educate workers for jobs held wide support during the high unemployment period of the Great Depression, and early neoliberals went so far as to argue that education was necessary only to adapt human beings to the constant changes in the economy. Today, the growth areas of the labor market tend to be in high-skilled, non-routine and cognitive jobs. This means any attempt at full employment increasingly requires new skills from workers, a demand that helps explain the aggressive efforts to reduce higher education to glorified job training. The overall societal aim becomes the production of competitive subjects undergoing constant self-improvement in an endless effort to be deemed employable. The demands that workers be constantly retraining and that policies support healthy economic growth are necessary components to the drive for full employment. But while calls for more jobs remain ideologically pervasive, the practical viability of full employment has largely disappeared. With tight labor markets in the post-war era, the ensuing strength of the working class increasingly became a problem for capitalism. The crisis of stagflation in the 1970s, in particular, presented an opportunity to reverse the priority given to employment. Class pressure and its effects, work stoppages, wage inflation, declining profits, were a major factor in central banks' decisions to raise interest rates, in the hope of reducing aggregate demand and increasing unemployment. Indeed, Thatcher's chief economic advisor eventually admitted that the war against inflation was in fact a proxy war against the working class. The tight monetary policy of the early 1980s was therefore precisely an effort to undermine the power of the working class, increase unemployment to a level acceptable for capital, and end the dream of full employment. Yet even if full employment had not been attacked, it requires strong economic growth, a condition that looks increasingly unlikely for the global economy. In recent years, global growth has remained significantly lower than during the pre-crisis period. Across the political spectrum, economists are warning that fundamental changes to the economy mean growth may have settled into a permanently lower state. Moreover, firms that are leading growth sectors, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, simply do not create jobs on the scale of classic firms like Ford and GM. In fact, new industries currently only employ 0.5% of the American workforce, hardly an inspiring record of job creation. And after a steady decline, the average new business creates 40% fewer jobs than it did 20 years ago. The old social democratic plan to encourage employment in new industries falters in the face of low labor intensity firms and sputtering economic growth. Still, it might be imagined that, with the right political pressure and policies, a return to full employment could be an option. But, given that the height of the social democratic era required the exclusion of women from the waged workforce, we should in fact wonder whether full employment has ever been possible. If full employment remains operative only as an ideological mystification, its normalization of work still extends to the unemployed. The transformation of welfare and the rise of workfare, forcing people to work in order to receive benefits, represent an increasingly insidious example of this. Mirroring the changing fortunes of full employment, unemployment has long been governed according to different ideas. Initial approaches saw unemployment as an individual accident, something to be mitigated by insurance-like solutions. But the mass unemployment of the Great Depression overwhelmed this approach, and unemployment subsequently came to be seen as a structural and male problem. The labor movement became an employment movement, and governments adopted welfare and full employment policies partly in response. Today, many of the transformations that the welfare state is undergoing can be understood as an attempt to revive the disciplinary function of the unemployed. Their free labor, in the form of workfare, acts to repress wages and threaten the jobs of the employed. The figure of the job seeker imposes a norm of work on everyone, and attacks on disability benefits turn even those outside the labor force into a reserve army of potential workers. The unemployed have to fulfill an increasingly long list of conditions in order to gain even minimal benefits, attending training, constantly applying for jobs, listening to advice, and even working for free. The increase in surveillance and control is designed to produce not only an obedient, skilled and flexible surplus population, but also one that exerts pressure on the employed. It therefore makes little difference whether these schemes actually reduce unemployment or not, since their purpose lies elsewhere. Increasingly, the welfare state is becoming little more than an institution designed to deploy the surplus against the working class. the management of surplus populations does not just revolve around the production of disciplined workers and pliable job seekers. Increasingly, domination and punitive measures are becoming the norm in dealing with the access to capital. For instance, the size and composition of this group is heavily regulated through immigration policies. For the surplus, migrating to countries with better job prospects is a common response to high unemployment and has been the historical norm. In the 19th century, as the mechanization of agriculture transformed the countryside, the dominant outlet was mass emigration to the New World. Yet today the option to migrate is increasingly closed off the developing world. While there are a variety of reasons voiced to justify tighter immigration controls, reducing the potentially unruly excess labor supply has often been a dominant one. Today, we see the militarization of America's border with Mexico and the rise of Fortress Europe in response to mistaken fears about jobs being taken by foreigners. Yet the desperation of immigrants to find a decent job is such that, even when faced with the threat of death, they still make the perilous trip to a new country. The result is that the past 15 years have seen over 22,000 migrants die trying to get into Europe, more than 6,000 die trying to cross the Mexico-US border, and over 1,500 die trying to get to Australia. These lethal barriers to migration are one of the primary mechanisms used today to segregate and manage global surplus populations. And inextricable from this treatment of migrants is racialized coding. These immigrants are not simply other individuals, but other races. Whether foreign hordes threatening the sanctity of the European border, or immigrant textile workers in Thailand being subject to hyper-exploitation and abuse, racial hierarchies are an essential component of the control of surplus populations. When the co-optation of the surplus into a disciplined excess workforce has failed, the state can always resort to simply locking up, excluding and brutalizing large sections of the surplus population. Across the world, mass incarceration has been increasing as the size of prison populations rise in both absolute and relative terms. Moreover, there is a significant racial component to this, most notably in the mass incarceration of the US black population, but also of Muslims in much of Europe, Aboriginals in Canada, and the detention and deportation of foreign migrants around the world. These systems of mass incarceration must be understood to extend beyond prisons, as they encompass an entire network of laws, courts, policies, habits and rules that work to subjugate a group of people. Mass incarceration is a system of social control aimed primarily at surplus populations rather than at crime. For example, increases in manufacturing unemployment are associated globally with increases in police employment. As the reserve army grows, so too does the state's punitive apparatus. Likewise, the expansion of immigrant detention centers responds to the demise of subsistence economies and the formation of a mobile proletariat. Those who are unwilling to be forced into slums seek better opportunities elsewhere, only to be locked up or left for dead on the Mediterranean. The American system is perhaps the clearest example of how surplus populations and police enforcement intertwine. The well-documented surge in mass incarceration over the past few decades was not a response to rising crime rates, but rather to the proliferation of jobless ghettos and the advances made by the civil rights movement. The racialized nature of this system is well known, but the patterns of incarceration cannot be fully understood without reference to class and surplus populations. For instance, middle-class and upper-class black populations are largely left alone, and the vast majority of the prison population consists of the working or workless poor. Likewise, the disparities in incarceration between races are outpaced by the disparities in terms of class, and the rise of mass black incarceration coincides with the decline in employment for that same population. In fact, the racial nature of mass incarceration in America stems exclusively from the wildly disproportionate locking up of lower-class black populations. Mass incarceration has therefore become a means to manage and control this surplus that has been excluded from the labor market and left in poverty. Spatially concentrated in inner-city ghettos, these groups became an easy target of state control. This intersects with race, of course, as the origins of jobless ghettos lie in the active exclusion of the black population of the United States. And in many ways, The carceral system perpetuates the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and the ghettos, replacing many of their functions with a new system of exclusion. But class enables us to see a distinction. Whereas those previous systems of social control exploited free labor and attempted to transform black populations into a disciplined workforce, the modern prison system is designed largely to exclude and control the surplus population. Given the effects of having a criminal record, the carceral system brings about a triple exclusion, from cultural and educational capital, from political participation and from public aid. The end result is that incarceration initiates a vicious circle with the urban poor left unemployed and unable to find a job, thereby endlessly reproducing these groups as outside of capital. Rather than trying to reform, educate and reintegrate prisoners into capitalist society, convoluted systems are set up to keep them out and to prevent their re-entry into normal wage labor after prison. At its extreme, these populations become simply disposable, situated outside of normal society and subject to gratuitous violence. The end result is a system that produces and reproduces permanent exclusion from the formal economy. These populations are deemed dispensable, and subjected to all the police brutality and state violence that can be mustered against them. We have, therefore, an entire range of mechanisms that the state and capital use to manage surplus populations, ranging from disciplined integration to violent exclusion. The crisis of work. As we have seen, there is a growing population of people that are situated outside formal, waged work, making do with minimal welfare benefits, informal subsistence work, or by illegal means. In all cases, the lives of these people are characterized by poverty, precarity and insecurity. Increasingly, there are simply not enough jobs to employ everyone. As the hegemonic order predicated upon decent and stable jobs breaks down, social control is likely to revert to increasingly coercive measures, harsher workfare, heightened antagonisms over immigration, stricter controls on the movement of peoples, and mass incarceration for those who resist being cast aside. This is the crisis of work facing neoliberalism and the surplus populations who make up most of the world's labor force. With the potential for extensive automation of work, a topic that will be discussed further in the next chapter, it is likely that we will see the following trends in the years to come. 1. The precarity of the developed economy's working class will intensify due to the surplus global labor supply, resulting from both globalization and automation. 2. Jobless recoveries will continue to deepen and lengthen, predominantly affecting those whose jobs can be automated at the time. 3. Slum populations will continue to grow due to the automation of low-skilled service work, and will be exacerbated by premature deindustrialization. 4. Urban marginality in the developed economies will grow in size as low-skilled, low-wage jobs are automated. 5. The transformation of higher education into job training will be hastened in a desperate attempt to increase the supply of high-skilled workers. 6. Growth will remain slow and make the expansion of replacement jobs unlikely. 7. The changes to workfare, immigration controls and mass incarceration will deepen as those without jobs are increasingly subjected to coercive controls and survival economies. Of course, none of these outcomes is inevitable. But this analysis is based on the current tendencies of capitalism, and on the problems that are likely to arise as surplus populations continue to grow. These trends portend a crisis of work, and a crisis of any society based upon the institution of wage labor. Under capitalism, jobs have been pivotal to our social lives and sense of who we are, as well as being the sole source of income for most people. What the next 2 decades portend is a future in which the global economy is increasingly unable to produce enough jobs, let alone good jobs, yet where we remain dependent upon jobs for our living. Political parties and trade unions appear ignorant of this crisis, struggling to manage its symptoms even as automation promises to toss more and more workers aside. In the face of these tensions, The political project for the 21st century left must be to build an economy in which people are no longer dependent upon wage labor for survival. As we will argue in the next few chapters, this struggle can and should span an array of different approaches. It means creating hegemonic ideas about the obsolescence of drudgery, shifting the goals of trade unions from resisting automation to job sharing and reduced working weeks, government subsidies for automation investment, and raising the cost of labor for capital, along with many other options. It means opposing the expulsion of surplus populations and attacking the mechanisms of control over them. Mass incarceration and the racialized system of domination associated with it must be abolished, and the spatial mechanisms of control, ranging from ghettos to border controls, must be taken apart to ensure the free movement of peoples. And the welfare state must be defended, not as an end in itself, but as a necessary component of a broader post-work society. The future remains open, and which direction the crisis of work takes is precisely the political struggle before us.